So hello and welcome to Doctor's Anatomy. Today we have with us the specimen of the cerebrum. So we are going to concentrate on to the external features of the cerebral hemisphere. So we will begin with the structures that we are going to discuss are the surfaces, borders as well as the poles and some of the sulcus and gyrus, which is going to help us in dividing this cerebral hemisphere into a frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe as well as occipital lobe. So let us start with the surfaces first. Over here in my hand, this is the left cerebral hemisphere, and whatever you can visualize this aspect over here, this whole and soul, this is the superolateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Another one, if I'm turning it down, these areas that you can visualize, this is known as an inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And if I'm turning it like this whatever the structures that you can visualize over here, this is the medial surface. So after discussing about the surfaces, let us discuss about the borders first. So the first border that we are going to see is the border that is starting from the anterior most part over here. From here, the border that is extended all the way up to the posterior pole, this border is known as an superior border. Okay, this is the superior border of the cerebral hemisphere. It is extended from the anterior pole all the way up to the posterior pole. So that is your superior border, first border. The another one that is present onto the inferior aspect. So you can see that another border is extended from the anterior pole all the way up to the posterior pole, but this time they are present onto the lateral aspect. Okay, so this is known as an infralateral border. Another one that is started again from the anterior pole all the way up to the posterior pole, but this time it is present onto the medial aspect. So this is known as your inframedial border. So these are the three borders. All the borders are extended from the anterior pole all the way up to the posterior pole, but the extension is the dimension is different. The superior border is extended like this onto the superior aspect, so that is why it is known as a superior border, whereas the infralateral border, it is again from the anterior pole all the way up to the posterior pole, but it is extended onto the lateral aspect. And the last one is the inframedial border, that is again started from the anterior pole all the way up to the posterior pole, but this time it is extended onto the medial aspect. So these are the borders and surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere. Now the next important point is the pole of the cerebral hemisphere. So the anterior most extension, if you are going to see, this is the frontal lobe, and the anterior most extended part of the frontal lobe is known as a frontal pole, whereas the posterior most extended part of the occipital lobe is known as an occipital pole, whereas the third pole is present in front of the temporal lobe. Okay, so anterior most extended part of the temporal lobe is known as a temporal pole. So these are the poles that you need to remember. Once you complete the pole, now the important thing that we are going to do is we are going to divide the cerebral hemisphere into lobes. So you will have the frontal lobe, you will have the parietal lobe over here, you will have the occipital lobe, and you will have the temporal lobe. So how to divide? What is the demarcations? For that we need to find out the certain sulcus first. So if you are going to see there is a red marked sulcus is present over here. Okay, it is extended uninterruptedly. Okay, so you can see it is extended uninterruptedly all the way up to the lateral sulcus. This is known as a lateral sulcus. So over here this is known as in your central sulcus, which is marked into the red color. Okay, so this is your central sulcus, this is over here, this is your lateral sulcus. Once you identify these two sulcus, now the another landmark that I want you to see is just in front of the 5 to 6 centimeter in front of the occipital pole. This is your occipital pole. In front of that you will find a notch. Okay, so if I am holding it like this, you will find this notch over here. Okay, so this is known as an pre-occipital notch. Okay, pre-occipital notch. Another point that you need to identify is a sulcus that is present over here onto, if I'm moving it towards the medial aspect, you will find the one sulcus is present over here, this. Okay, this is known as an occipital sulcus, pre-occipital sulcus. Okay, the some part is also present onto this aspect. Okay, so these are the sulcus that you need to remember. Now once you are aware about all this sulcus, now we can divide the cerebral hemisphere into the certain pole. So the first imaginary line that you have to draw is, it is started from the pre-occipital notch all the way up to this sulcus, pre-occipital sulcus. So this, from here it is started and it will run like this and it will reach all the way up to here. So the part that is situated behind the first imaginary line, that part is known as an occipital lobe. Another one that you have to draw, the second imaginary line that is started from your lateral sulcus. Okay, and it should extend it all the way up to the meeting point of your first imaginary line. That first imaginary line is extended from the pre-occipital notch all the way up to the occipital sulcus. Okay, so this is the demarcation point. It should be look like this. This is the lateral sulcus. I am extending it all the way up to the first imaginary line. Okay, and your first imaginary line is situated like this. Okay, so this is how you are going to divide your cerebral hemisphere. Okay, now if you remember the central sulcus, whatever the structures that are present above your lateral sulcus but in front of the central sulcus, so this is above the lateral sulcus and in front of the central sulcus, that area is known as an frontal pole. Okay, another one, the whatever the structures that is present above the lateral sulcus but behind the central sulcus and in front of your first imaginary line. Okay, that area is known as your parietal lobe. So this is your central sulcus, this is your lateral sulcus. Just above the lateral sulcus, behind the central sulcus and in front of your first imaginary line, that area is known as your parietal lobe. Then whatever the structures that are present below the lateral sulcus but in front of your first imaginary line, that area is known as an temporal lobe. This is your temporal lobe. So now you can understand how this cerebral hemisphere is divided into a lobe by the two imaginary line. Again, quickly recap, the first imaginary line is started from the pre-occipital notch all the way up to your pre-occipital sulcus. Okay, so this is your first imaginary line. The second imaginary line is just continuation of the lateral sulcus all the way up to the meeting point of the first imaginary line. Okay, so it will be extended like this and it is extended, first imaginary line extended from here to here, and the second imaginary line will meet up like this. So it will look like this. Okay, now you can understand the part which is lying behind my first imaginary line, that should be known as an occipital lobe. The another one, the whatever the structures that is present above my first imaginary line but in front of the central sulcus, that area is known as an frontal pole. Again, above the second imaginary line but behind the central sulcus and in front of the first imaginary line, that area is known as the parietal lobe. And what are the structures that is present below my second imaginary line or the lateral sulcus, and in front of the first imaginary line, that should be known as the temporal lobe. Thank you. So once you understand the external features, now let us see what are the sulcus and gyrus are present in the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so the first sulcus that we already identified is this one, the red color marked area over here. This is known as an central sulcus. In front of that you will find the precentral sulcus, and behind that you will find the postcentral sulcus. So these are the three sulcus that are present over here. Now let us see what are the sulcus and gyrus present in the frontal lobe. So if you are going to see the frontal lobe, the first sulcus that you can see is this sulcus. Okay, so this is known as an superior frontal sulcus, and another one that you can visualize is in this area. This is the inferior frontal gyrus. So you can see that the superior frontal sulcus and inferior frontal sulcus, they are dividing the frontal lobe into three parts. That will be the superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. So these are the two sulcus and three gyrus are present into the frontal lobe. Now remember the lateral sulcus. Over here, this is your lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus is further divided into three parts. These three parts are whatever this structure over here, this is known as an posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus over here. Then if I am closing it, you can find out one sulcus is extended into the upward direction over here. This is known as an ascending ramus. Another one that you can visualize is this area. This is the anterior horizontal ramus of the lateral sulcus. So lateral sulcus itself is divided into three parts: the posterior ramus, the ascending ramus, and the anterior horizontal ramus. Now this part is going to divide this area into three parts. These are the structures that is present between the anterior horizontal ramus and ascending ramus. This area is known as an pars triangularis. Whatever the structures that is present behind this ascending ramus, that area is known as a pars opercularis, and whatever the structures that are present inferior to your anterior horizontal sulcus, so these are known as an pars orbicularis. So pars orbicularis, pars triangularis, and pars opercularis. So these are the structures that you need to remember over here. Now let us see what are the structures present into the temporal lobe. So if you are going to see the temporal lobe, you will easily identify the two sulcus. This is the superior temporal sulcus. Over here you will find the inferior temporal sulcus. So you can see there is a superior temporal sulcus and inferior temporal sulcus. It is going to give you the three gyrus: superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, as well as the inferior temporal gyrus. Superior, middle, as well as inferior temporal gyrus. So these are the two sulcus and three gyrus are present in this area. Now let us see the parietal lobe. Over here you can see one horizontal sulcus is present. Okay, this is going to divide your parietal lobe into two parts: the superior parietal lobules and the inferior parietal lobules. So this is known as the parietal sulcus, which is going to divide your parietal lobe into the superior lobules and the inferior lobules. Then you can identify the one sulcus is present over here just in front of the occipital pole. Okay, this sulcus is known as the lunate sulcus. This sulcus is known as the lunate sulcus. So once you turn down onto the medial aspect, whatever the structures that we are going to see, first important structure that you will see, the fiber-like structures over here. This is known as an corpus callosum. immediately above the corpus callosum you will find a sulcus is present. Okay, this sulcus is known as an callosial sulcus. This one is known as an callosial sulcus. After that you will find that elevation is there. This is known as an cingulate gyrus. Immediately above that you will find another sulcus. This is known as an cingulate sulcus. So these are the sulcus and gyrus that is present onto the medial aspect. Now let us see what are the structure sulcus and gyrus present onto the posterior aspect of the medial surface. So the first one that we already talked, this one. Okay, this is known as an parieto-occipital sulcus over here. Okay, which is our helping us to draw the first imaginary line, if you remember. Now after that you will find another Y-shaped sulcus is there. Okay, over here. This is known as an calcarine sulcus. Okay, this is known as an calcarine sulcus. Now this calcarine sulcus and your parieto-occipital sulcus is dividing this area into three parts. The parts are the structures that are present between your calcarine sulcus and your parieto-occipital sulcus. That area is known as an cuneus. Okay, so this area is known as an cuneus. What are the structures that are present in front of the parieto-occipital sulcus but behind the corpus callosum? This area is known as an precuneus. So over here you will have the precuneus, over here you will have the cuneus, and then one elevated area is there inferior to your calcarine sulcus, that is known as a lingual gyrus. This is known as a lingual gyrus. So you will find the three structures. The lingual gyrus that is present inferior to your calcarine sulcus, the cuneus that is found between your calcarine sulcus and your parieto-occipital sulcus, and then you will find the precuneus area that is present in front of your parieto-occipital sulcus but behind the corpus callosum. Okay, so these are the sulcus and gyrus that is important and you need to remember this. Thank you very much for seeing our video.